Hello everyone, and welcome to Madcap Experiments, the Magic the Gathering podcast that focuses on creative, and sometimes even competitive decks in Pioneer, Standard, and occasionally Modern. I'm your host, Odince. Today, we are going to be brewing with some decks featuring Tannuk, Steadfast Second, Bygone Colossus, as well as a deck that I just came up with at the last minute. First up is my take on a Big Red list for Standard. Big Red is a fan favorite, and I think Tannuk does wonders to enable this type of strategy. So let's refresh ourselves on Tannuk's abilities. Tannuk is 2 red for a 3/5 legendary creature Kavu pilot that reads, other creatures you control have haste, artifact cards and red creature cards in your hand have warp for 2 and a red. So he lets us cheat in powerful creatures and artifacts, and he also gives them haste. Tannuk really gets the brain going with possibilities. I think an important line of text here is that Tannuk gives any artifact spells in your hand warp, not just colorless or red ones. Not sure how often that will come up, but you could cheat in something like Valor's Flagship in Standard, crew it with Tannuk, and then swing with a 7/7 flying first strike lifelink. We also got some really powerful and expensive artifacts in Edge of Eternities that are great to cast with warp. Extinguisher Battleship being at the top of that list. Warp is also an alternate casting cost, so it will work with stuff like Cityscape Leveler and Pioneer, getting you both the cast trigger and the attack trigger thanks to the haste. Threefold Thunderhulk is another fun option that also benefits from entering with haste, and since you're getting it on a discount, you'll probably have extra mana left over to use its ability. Tannuk probably isn't going to do too much for you the turn it comes down, so you really need to follow it up with a powerful play. The Big Red list I've mentioned aims to do just that. This list is trying to cheat in hasty red overlords and trumpeting connoisseurs. And thanks to a couple of copies of the Fire Crystal from the Final Fantasy set, we get some redundancy to make that happen. The Overlord gets to hit something for 4 damage, attack for 5, and then hit something again. That's 13 damage on an empty board. Connoisseur comes in as a 7/6 with trample and discovers 5. That makes Bloodbraid Elf look sad in comparison. And the best part is, when these creatures get exiled at the end of the turn, we can do it all over again next turn, assuming the game isn't over at that point. We are running some copies of the Ironcrag, as well as a playset of Zookeeper Mechan, a 2-mana 1/3 dork in red to help accelerate this game plan to as early as turn 4. What I really like about Overlord and Connoisseur, and a big reason I have high hopes for this list, is that these cards aren't dead in our hands if we don't draw the right combination of pieces. While not the best on rate, sometimes 3 mana for 3 damage is the only thing that's going to save you against an opposing Vivi. To round out the list, I've included a playset of Screaming Nemesis and Possibility Technician, as well as some solid red removal. Nemesis is a creature that's already done a lot to prove itself, but I like that it's great both offensively and defensively. It's a great blocker when you're on the back foot, potentially allowing you to trade up in combat. Possibility Technician is a new creature from Edge of Eternities, and for 2 and a red, we get a 3/3 Kavu Artificer that reads, whenever this creature or another Kavu you control enters, exile the top card of your library. For as long as that card remains exiled, you may play it if you control a Kavu, and it has warp for 1 and a red. I really like this card. It can act as an impulse to help find land drops or fish for interaction, or we can just slam it on turn 3 and get a little bit of card advantage. I think the modality here is important, but it's probably going to take a few matches to really get a feel for how Technician plays. On its own, you can get up to 2 extra cards off of it, but it really begins to snowball when you draw it in multiples. Not to mention Tannuk is also a Kavu that triggers it, and Soulstone Sanctuary can let us cast exiled cards if our Technician was removed from the field. In Pioneer, we get access to Mutavault, so we can play those cards for just an extra colorless mana. Quick side note, Tannuk only gives the cards in your hand warp, so any exiled cards with the Technician will have to be paid for in full. I still think it earns the slot here. Things really heat up with the Technician when we have a way to give it haste, either with Tannuk or the Fire Crystal. I really like how Technician plays with the Fire Crystal in particular. We get to warp it in for a single red mana, and then play it again on the next turn for just 1 and a red. So for the regular cost of Technician, we've got to attack twice and impulse twice. The Fire Crystal also has a mana sink ability that lets us make temporary copies of the Technician to impulse even more. This deck has a lot of strong individual pieces that combine in some very interesting ways that ultimately looks like it'll be very fun to play. I don't think the deck necessarily has to be mono red either. I've considered a Boros splash for something like Lightning Army of 1, and to have access to powerful sideboard options like High Noon. Something like a hasty Bruce Tarl can come in and maybe even make some hasted Double Strike Oxen, so there's a lot of flexibility here with color pairs. I also have a Pioneer list that looks pretty similar. I'm not sure if that's a good sign, but we've had some really strong cards come through Standard lately. A link to the list will be in the description, but ultimately the game plan is going to be pretty similar, so I'm not going to go in depth on that one. Next up is a Darreti Rocketeer Engineer list that gets a big assist with Tannuk. I mentioned last episode that Rakdos mana in Standard is tough, but what's the point of brewing if we're only going to try and play the most optimal decks? So with that, let's take a look at Rakdos Darreti featuring Tannuk. To start, Darreti is 4 and a red for a legendary Goblin Artificer that reads, Darreti's power is equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control, and whenever Darreti enters or attacks, you can choose target artifact in your graveyard, you may sacrifice an artifact, and if you do, return the chosen card to the battlefield. It's got 5 toughness. So like Tannuk, Darreti lets you cheat in big artifacts. The ability to loot or otherwise set up the grave isn't going to be the best in Standard, so I like that Tannuk gets these cards out of our hand while also playing around graveyard hate and post-board games. Not to mention, Tannuk can let us warp in Darreti, or even just hardcast it to get double triggers, thanks to that haste. So what are we trying to cheat in here? Extinguisher Battleship seems custom made to work with Darreti. It blows up a non-creature permanent and deals 4 damage to the board. Darreti has 5 toughness, and its station is for 5 counters. Darreti will be up to 8 power thanks to the Battleship. Tannuk lets us warp in Battleship for cheap, and also survives the board wipe effect, so the ship definitely earns a couple slots. Next, and the card that really got me excited to try out Rakdos is Coldstoke Gearhulk, a 5 mana 5/4 with Menace and Death Touch that reads, when this creature enters, put target creature with mana value 4 or less from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. That creature gains Menace, Death Touch, and Haste. At the beginning of your next end step, exile that creature. So it's only 5 mana, but the casting cost is pretty steep, so it seems fine to cheat in. And as I mentioned, Tannuk lets us double up on the ETBs by warping said creatures. The Gearhulk seems really powerful to me. You can steal one of your opponent's creatures that died, or bring back a Tannuk, a Krenko's Bugscrusher, or even a Demon Wall, which might seem a little weird at first. Demon Wall is a 3/3 with Defender, which makes for a nice blocker, but it can attack if it has a counter on it, and Gearhulk gives it a finality counter. Krenko's Bugscrusher, as I mentioned, makes an appearance. Great stats and a solid ETB. Great to bring in with either Gearhulk, Tannuk, or Darreti. Edge of Eternities also has this crazy card called Scrounge for Eternities. It's a sorcery for 2 and a black that reads, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature. Return target creature or spacecraft with mana value 5 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then create a lander token. It's another card that seems custom made for Darreti. It even gives a token to sacrifice, but it also grabs all of our other high value threats too. One of Tannuk's biggest weaknesses is that it can just die without really doing anything. Having a few different ways to get it back is really nice. We have Melded Moxite here as an artifact way to loot that can make a 2/2 in a pinch, and Collector's Vault also helps us loot while ramping and fixing. There are also a couple of Secluded Starforge in the mana base to either pump up a creature's attack or make us some 2/2s. The rest of the list is full of pretty standard artifacts that I've had in some of my other decks. Hopefully that mana base doesn't hinder this deck too much, because I think it has a lot of potential. That's it for the Tannuk list at the moment, but I think it's a card I'll definitely brew with again. I just wanted to take a moment here to give a shout out to the Big Mamu over in the Faithless Brewing Discord. I've talked to them a little bit about some Darreti brews, and I think they're coming up with some really cool stuff. So definitely check out their YouTube channel if you haven't already seen it. There's some really great and creative stuff over there. From here, I've got a couple of lists featuring Bygone Colossus, one in Pioneer and one in Standard. Colossus is a 9 mana 9/9 robot giant with the text Warp 3. That's it. So we can pay 3 mana to get a 9/9 that doesn't do anything and leaves at the end of the turn. Is there any way we can make this useful? I think so. The first list is a mono blue Stompy affinity list in Standard. The cards we're looking to use to take advantage of the Colossus here are Synthesizer Labship, Emissary Escort, and Uthros, Titanic God Core. Let's start with Labship. For a single blue, we get an artifact that's a spacecraft with Station. A quick reminder, Station is an ability that lets you tap a creature at sorcery speed to put a number of charge counters on that permanent equal to the tapped creature's power. Sort of like crewing a vehicle, except not usually all at once. So for 2 charge counters, Labship becomes a minion soul artifact, letting us power up another artifact at the beginning of combat and giving it base power, toughness, 2/2, and flying. At 9 charge counters, it becomes a 4/4 with flying and vigilance. 9 is kind of the perfect number here, since Colossus happens to station it fully. So we can play Lab Ship on 1, another random artifact on 2, perhaps something like a nutrient block, and then warp Colossus in on turn 3, station the Lab Ship, and then swing with a 4/4 and a 2/2 in the air. Next is Emissary Escort. For 1 and a blue, we get a 0/4 robot soldier that gains X power, where X is the greatest mana value among other artifacts we control. So even though we can warp it in for 3 mana, Colossus is always a 9 mana value permanent. That means we can swing with the Escort as a 9/4 on turn 3. If we happen to have a Lab Ship on 1, Escort on 2, and then Colossus on 3, we can station the Lab Ship like before, make the Escort a flying 2/2 that will still gain 9 power, and attack for a total of 15 in the air on turn 3 in Standard. And then we have Uthros, Titanic God Core. It's an enter the battlefield tap land that's also a planet. That means it also gets the station ability. While I generally think the station ability isn't that good, as I think you'd rather just be attacking with the creatures that you're tapping, Uthros has a huge upside. For 12 counters, it gains the ability for tap and a blue, add a blue mana for each artifact you control. Colossus gets us most of the way there when it comes down, and Uthros gives us a realistic way to bring back the Colossus from exile. So those are the main uses for Colossus here. You can play something like Splash Portal to cheat it onto the field permanently, but that feels off game plan for what the rest of the deck is trying to do. I do have a list that will appear in another episode that does try to flicker some powerful warp creatures into play, so stay tuned for that. Speaking of warp, I'm running a couple of copies of Mechanozoa, which, if you don't remember from the spoiler season, I don't blame you. It's a 6 mana 5/5 that also warps for 3, and when it enters the battlefield, it can tap an artifact or a creature and put a stun counter on it. It gives us some redundancy here with Emissary Escort, and it can also tap down a potential blocker to make sure it's getting in for 6. We also have Memory Guardian and Valkyrie Aerial Unit, 2 blue flyers with affinity to increase Escort's power, and then the rest of the list is a bunch of cheap artifacts and role players to tie everything together. Nutrient Block makes a nice indestructible flyer with Lab Ship like I mentioned before, and I've included a playset of Zoetic Glyph in this list, the 3 mana and Soul, so we can also make it an indestructible 5/4. Full playset of Lava Boots here to discount our affinity creatures and then hopefully haste them up, and the Ward 1 is a nice little bonus. And on turn 4, we can even haste up a Colossus and get in for 10. Leyline Axe is the last real artifact in this list, and it pairs very nicely with Escort. If we manage to open with Axe, Escort comes down as a 2 mana 4/4, and we can even equip it on turn 3 to get in for 5/5 Double Strike. Imagine following that up with a Colossus. Similar to my Pioneer and Soul list last episode, Leyline Axe is a nice mana sink in the later turns to power up all of your threats. Zoetic Glyph not only powers up our nutrient blocks, but something like Escort gains power on top of the base stats of 5/4. The Discover 3 is a nice bonus too, to help counteract the opponent's removal. There are a couple of copies of Scene of the Crime here in the mana base as an artifact land to discount the affinity creatures, but the fact that they come into play tap might mean that they don't end up being worth it in the long run. Still something I think is worth trying. And that's it for the standard list. I think it's going to be a blast to play and have some really fun lines. On to Pioneer, and we get some really nice additions to pair with Bygone Colossus. Stuff like Eldrazi Mimic, Sanctum of Ugin, and Generator Servant. Let's take a look. Eldrazi Mimic plays a similar role here as Emissary Escort did in the standard list. It's a 2 mana 2/1 that can copy the stats of a colorless creature when that creature enters the battlefield. Another way to swing for 9 on turn 3. Sanctum of Ugin is a land that says, whenever you cast a colorless spell with converted mana cost 7 or greater, you may sacrifice Sanctum of Ugin, and if you do, search your library for a colorless creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So again, even though we're only paying 3 mana for the Colossus, it's a 9 mana value permanent, so that lets us tutor up another colorless creature with Sanctum, potentially even another Colossus, which I do think will come up. Generator Servant is a 2/1 for 1 and a red that reads, tap, sacrifice this creature, add 2 colorless. If that mana is spent on a creature spell, it gains haste until the end of turn. So Servant on 2 can let us haste in a Colossus on turn 3, and more importantly, if we hit our land drops, we can actually cast both Mimic and Colossus off of the Servant mana to get in for 18 damage on turn 3. That interaction works similarly to how Arena of Glory works in Modern with multiple creatures. This list also has 4 Summon Brynhilder, another 2 mana 2/1 that acts as redundant copies of Servant to haste out our Colossus. One sequence I really like here is Brynhildr into a Colossus, and if we have Sanctum of Ugin, we can go into another Colossus for next turn, which Brynhildr will also grant haste. Unfortunately, if you happen to exile a Colossus with Brynhildr's first ability, you won't be able to warp it, since warp only works from hand. From here, the list has other solid role players. Bone Crusher is pretty self-explanatory, but Servant lets us use both the adventure and the creature on turn 3 in a pinch. Brynhildr granting it haste is also a nice bonus. Thought-Knot Seer can be grabbed off of Sanctum, and pumps our Mimic while providing some disruption. If we have a bit of a slower start, we can use Thought-Knot Seer to take key disruption and help set up for a combo the following turn. Handweir Garrison might be a little bit too cute here, but it benefits greatly from haste, and I wanted to sneak in a couple of Handweir Battlements into the mana base as another way to grant haste in a pinch, so I figured why not. And then lastly is a couple copies of Callous Sellsword, taking a play right out of the Mouse Handbook to fling a huge creature at our opponent. I was thinking that Molten Duplication could also work as a way to double up the damage, and also works nicely with our utility creatures like Garrison and Thought-Knot, but the extra mana might be too much to make it work. So that wraps up Bygone Colossus for this episode. I was originally going to show off a couple of my favorite rogue strategies here to end off the show, but after listening to the latest Faithless Brewing episode, I came up with this last list and got too excited to share it, so those will have to wait until the next episode. The last list is a Boros Flurry deck for Pioneer, using the new Cosmogrand Zenith in conjunction with some other powerful spells like Quarry Steel Cutter and Nurturing Pixie. Zenith is 2 and a white for a 2/4 that reads, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, choose one. Create 2 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Cosmogrand Zenith might look similar to Monastery Mentor, a card that has existed in Pioneer's entirety and done largely nothing, but I actually think it's so much better. We'll get into why shortly. The Faithless Brewing guys mentioned using Helping Hand, a white unearth that returns the creature tapped, but I figured for an extra mana we could play Recommission. It can return an artifact as well as a creature, so we can also get back our cutters, and it returns the creatures untapped with a +1/+1 counter to boot. Instead of going all in on trying to loot Zenith and then rebuy it with Recommission, which I think might end up being a little clunky, I've decided to just include a couple of copies for value. I'm opting to enable Zenith and Cutter with 0 mana artifacts, and while we don't have Mishra's Bauble or Mox Opal in Pioneer for our high value 0 mana spells, we do have Ornithopter and Tormod's Crypt. Not very exciting, I know, but I do think they'll play out better than they sound at first. It is worth mentioning that we do have Mox Amber and now Mox Jasper, but I didn't have any legends or dragons that I thought were worth playing in the list. Monastery Mentor shells in the past have had the issue of sometimes just drawing the wrong half of your deck. Mentor is only enabled by non-creature spells, where Cutter and Cosmogrand Zenith just care about the number of spells, so you can just jam creatures and keep establishing your board while triggering these permanents. And I think that's where Ornithopter, and by extension Tormod's Crypt, come into play. Aside from enabling both Zenith and Cutter the turn that you cast them, they also enable stuff like Nurturing Pixie, Rally the Monastery, and even Sage of the Skies. Ornithopter wears the counters from Zenith quite nicely, and Tormod's Crypt gets us extra free prowess triggers here and there. Ornithopter lets us play a Pixie as a 2/2 flyer on turn 1, and then we can save it to enable a Cutter or a Zenith on future turns. Outside of just being a strong turn 1 play, Pixie makes sure we will have a constant stream of spells in the later turns as well. I've included a couple of copies of Shepherd of the Flock here to act as redundant copies of Pixie that also combines with Pixie for a nice resource loop. Next is Rally the Monastery, an instant for 3 and a white that reads, this spell costs 2 less to cast if you've cast another spell this turn. Choose one. Create 2 1/1 white monk creature tokens with prowess. Up to 2 target creatures you control each get +2/+2 until the end of turn, or destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. There's a lot of flexibility here, but getting 2 prowess tokens on turn 2 seems really strong. Sage of the Skies might not end up being in the final draft, but it seems too fun not to try. It's a 2/3 with flying and lifelink for 2 and a white that reads, when you cast this spell, if you've cast another spell this turn, copy this spell. That copy is a token. It also pairs very nicely with the copies of Cunning Coyote that I've included, as well as Pixie or Shepherd to make more copies if you have the mana. You can attack with the original, and then in the second main, bounce it and play it again. I mentioned Cunning Coyote. It's another solid enabler that lets us attack with a 3/5 Cosmogrand Zenith on turn 3 and make some tokens along the way. It's also decent to recommission or bounce with Pixie. There are a few Voice of Victory here to help make sure your plays go through. It's just a solid card all around, and it's even showing up in some modern Boros lists. The last card of note here is the couple of copies of Webstalker Ardent I want to try out. It's a 3-mana 2/3 with Warp for a single red that reads, whenever another creature or artifact you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. There are going to be a lot of things entering the battlefield to trigger this, and the cheap war cost really helps us double spell. I'm hoping it kind of ends up like a Goblin Bombardment at home. I think there are a lot of really fun and powerful synergies here that can lead to some aggressive starts, as well as a really impressive grind game. I can't wait to try this one out. And that wraps it up for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Next episode will feature a real variety of decks and strategies, and I promise I'll include some lists that aren't mainly red. I hope you all have a great day. This is Odince, signing off.